Mercedes did not lose Monaco because of one bad setup. They lost something far more dangerous. They lost the protection of the gray area. For months, rivals believed Mercedes had found the smartest gaps in the new rules. The engine was questioned. The front wing was investigated. Straight mode was removed. And then, at the exact race where the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile tightened the checks, Ferrari delivered a 1-2, Hamilton won in red, and Mercedes suddenly looked beatable. That is not a coincidence. That is the warning. Because now the biggest question in Formula One is no longer whether Mercedes built the fastest car. It is whether the W17 is still the fastest when every loophole starts closing. The engine advantage. The 400 millisecond wing controversy. The extreme Monaco winglet solution. The hot compliance test. The missing straight mode. Every piece connects to the same uncomfortable truth. Mercedes is not just being chased on track. Mercedes is being investigated by the rulebook itself. And if Monaco was the first glimpse of what happens when the gray areas disappear, then Russell, Antonelli, and Toto Wolff may be facing the one battle no dominant team can escape. Proving they are still unbeatable, when the clever tricks no longer protect them. Subscribe to the channel. For Mercedes, the most dangerous part of this story is not that Monaco went wrong. It is that Monaco made the pattern impossible to ignore. Before the race weekend even began, Mercedes was already carrying more pressure than any championship-leading team would want. On paper, they still had the car everyone feared. They had the Constructors' Championship lead. They had Kimi Antonelli leading the Drivers' Championship. They had George Russell close enough to keep the team's internal fight alive. But behind all of that success, one uncomfortable question had been following them since the start of the season. How much of this dominance came from pure speed, and how much came from reading the rulebook more aggressively than everyone else? That is the real foundation of the Monaco crisis. Because when Formula One introduced the new 2026 regulations, it did not just change the cars. It changed the places where clever teams could search for advantage. New power units. New active aerodynamics. New limits. New testing methods. New gray areas. And Mercedes, as usual, appeared to understand those gray areas faster than most. That sounds like praise. And in Formula One, it often is. The greatest teams in history have always lived at the edge of what the rules allow. They do not only ask what is written. They ask what is missing. They look for the silence between the sentences. They search for the gap nobody noticed until the car is already winning. But there is a risk. When you build too much of your advantage in the gray, every rival starts trying to drag that gray area into the light. That is exactly what happened to Mercedes. The first pressure point was the engine. The new rules reduced the compression ratio limit from 18:1 down to 16:1. To keep it simple, compression is how tightly the engine squeezes the fuel and air before it burns. More squeeze can mean more force. More force can mean more power. It is like squeezing a spring. Push it a little, and it gives you a little energy back. Push it harder, and the release is stronger. Formula One wanted to reduce that potential advantage, so the limit was lowered. But then rivals noticed something that changed the mood. The original compliance check measured the engine in cold conditions, with the car stationary in the pit lane. That sounds normal until you remember one simple thing. A racing engine does not live in cold conditions. It lives under heat, stress, expansion, brutal pressure. Metal parts change when temperature rises. They move. They grow. They behave differently. And that opened the question Mercedes did not want hovering over its season. Could an engine be designed to look legal when cold, but operate with a greater advantage when hot? Rival manufacturers, especially Audi, Honda, and Ferrari, raised concerns with the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile. The suspicion was that Mercedes' high-performance powertrains had found a way to pass the 16:1 measurement when stationary, while gaining behavior closer to the previous 18:1 level during real racing conditions. That accusation was never just about machinery. It was about trust. Because if a team passes the test exactly as written, it can say the car is legal. But if rivals believe the test itself is incomplete, they will say the legal check is not telling the full story. That is the oldest fight in Formula One. Is it genius because the rules allowed it? Or is it unfair because the rules failed to catch it? Toto Wolff made his position very clear. Mercedes had passed the checks. Mercedes was legal. Rivals were complaining because they had not found the same advantage. To him, an ingenious idea was one that complied with the rule and had been approved by the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile. That argument is powerful. But it also reveals why this became so tense. Mercedes was not saying the rivals misunderstood the basic concept. Mercedes was saying the rule, as written and tested, had been satisfied. And in Formula One, that is a very specific kind of defense. It is not emotional. It is legal. It says, show us the rule we broke. But rivals were not only trying to prove Mercedes broke the existing test. They were trying to change the test itself. And eventually, they succeeded. The Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile introduced a new hot measurement procedure. Instead of checking only in cold conditions, the compression ratio would also be measured at 130 degrees Celsius. That one change mattered more than it sounded. Because it closed the temperature gap. It made the test look more like the real conditions of a working engine. It removed the possibility that a car could be compliant in the garage, but more powerful on the circuit. And the timing made it explosive. The stricter test was moved forward to June 1st, just in time for the Monaco Grand Prix weekend. That meant Monaco was not just the next race. It was the first major proof point. Mercedes now had to perform under a tightened interpretation of the engine rules, after months of rivals arguing that their advantage came from a loophole. That is why the pressure was already building before anyone even looked at the wing. Because if Mercedes dominated Monaco, they could say the new checks changed nothing. They could say the car was fast because the car was good. They could point to performance as proof that rivals had wasted months chasing shadows. But if Mercedes struggled, even slightly, every rival would draw the same conclusion. Maybe the loophole mattered. That is the brutal reality of Formula One politics. Sometimes the evidence is not a document. Sometimes the evidence is a lap time. And then, just when the engine story was already dangerous enough, the front wing controversy returned to the center of attention. This was the second pressure point. After the Chinese Grand Prix, footage of the Mercedes front wing became a major talking point. The concern was not that the wing moved at all. Under the new regulations, movement was allowed. The problem was how quickly it moved. The rule required active aerodynamic elements to transition within 400 milliseconds. Less than half a second. Almost instant. But slow-motion analysis suggested the Mercedes wing might have taken around 800 milliseconds in certain moments, especially at turn 14 in Shanghai. Double the limit. On its own, that would already be serious. But the theory that followed made it much worse. Some observers wondered whether the wing was closing in two phases. A fast movement first, enough to satisfy the measurement. Then a slower continuation afterward, giving the car a performance benefit in the braking zone. Think of it like a door with a sensor. The sensor thinks the door is shut, but the door keeps moving after the sensor stops checking. If that had been deliberate, it would not just be a slow wing. It would be a system designed around the blind spot of the regulation. That is why Ferrari contacted the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile. Red Bull and McLaren also raised questions. Nobody wanted to watch Mercedes build a championship lead with a system that others believed might be exploiting a hidden timing advantage. The Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile investigated. And Mercedes was cleared. The explanation was not a secret program or hidden command. It was insufficient hydraulic pressure. At higher speeds, aerodynamic load was too heavy for the system to close the flap as quickly as expected. In plain English, the air was pushing back harder than Mercedes had planned. That sounds like relief. And for Mercedes, legally, it was. No punishment. No disqualification. No evidence of deliberate wrongdoing. But the damage was not completely erased. Because by that point, Mercedes had become the team everyone was studying. The engine had been questioned. The wing had been investigated. The rule checks had changed. Rivals had already learned that pressure on the governing body could produce action. That matters. Because once a dominant team becomes a regulatory target, every clever solution becomes risky. A normal upgrade no longer looks normal. An unusual shape no longer looks harmless. A legal loophole no longer looks like pure innovation. It starts looking like the next fight. That is how Mercedes walked into Monaco. Not as a guilty team, but as a watch team. And there is a difference. A guilty team fears punishment. A watch team fears interpretation. Every detail can become a story. Every performance swing can become an accusation. Every new part can become a question whispered through the paddock until it reaches the people who write the rules. That is why the Monaco weekend was so dangerous before the extreme wing solution even appeared. Mercedes did not just need to be fast. They needed to be clean. They needed to be convincing. They needed to show that when the engine test changed, when rivals questioned the wing, when the gray areas narrowed, the car was still strong enough to stand on its own. But then Monaco removed another weapon. Straight mode. The active aerodynamic system that helped define the new era could not be used around the Monte Carlo streets. The circuit was too narrow, too tight, too unforgiving. The walls were too close, the risk too high, and no section was suitable for safe activation. So every car had to run without that moving aero advantage. For Mercedes, that was a massive shift. Because the W17 had been built around the new active aero philosophy. Straight mode was not just a bonus. It was part of how the car created its speed, part of how the engineers balanced the package, part of how the drivers expected the machine to behave. At Monaco, that comfort disappeared. No engine gray area left untouched. No wing controversy forgotten. No straight mode available. And now Mercedes had to find performance through something else. That is where the extreme wing loophole entered the story. With active aero disabled, the rear wing actuator no longer had its normal job. The part that would usually help operate the moving system was suddenly redundant. And when Formula One engineers see unused space, they do not see empty space. They see opportunity. Red Bull used that opportunity with small wing elements. Mercedes went further. They created a more aggressive structure, almost like branches, carrying multiple tiny aerodynamic surfaces. These microflaps were designed to create extra downforce, especially valuable at Monaco, where grip and confidence mean everything. And technically, that kind of creativity is exactly what Formula One rewards. But politically, it was dangerous. Because Mercedes was no longer introducing that solution in a neutral environment. They were introducing it after months of arguments about engines, wings, timing windows, hot tests, cold tests, and the difference between genius and exploitation. So the extreme winglet solution became more than a Monaco upgrade. It became a symbol. A symbol of how Mercedes operates at the edge. A symbol of why rivals keep pushing the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile. A symbol of why this season has shifted from pure racing into regulatory warfare. And that is the key point of Block 1. Mercedes' big trouble is not simply that the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile looked at one part. It is that the governing body, the rivals, and the entire paddock are now looking at the same philosophy. The Mercedes method. Find the gap. Use the gap. Defend the gap. Force everyone else to react. That method can win championships. But it also creates enemies. And at Monaco, those enemies finally saw the door open. Because Ferrari was fast. Hamilton was alive in red. Leclerc was right there. Verstappen was close enough to punish any mistake. Russell and Antonelli were no longer driving from a position of complete control. The perfect Mercedes story had become complicated. And once a dominant team becomes complicated, the next question is unavoidable. Is this just one difficult weekend, or is this the first sign that the season is turning against them?